Good evening, and welcome to Cast in Chains. Well, that's what we're going to be calling it. It's our little webcast from Paranormal Historic Tasmania, and it's going to be mostly about the paranormal, but history as well, and some weird stuff, weird and wacky stuff. Just anything that interests us and hopefully interests you. So, this episode, our first episode, is going to be about Halloween and how Tasmanians celebrated Halloween back in the mid to late 19th century and into the middle of the 20th century. It's a little bit different to what is celebrated now, and but there are similarities, and it just goes to show that it's not an American thing completely. Maybe today's Halloween is certainly influenced by the American, more commercialised version, but rest assured, Tasmanians were celebrating Halloween way back, and this will tell you about some of those traditions that they were following. So, firstly, I'll start off with an origin of Halloween, and I thought this article from the Thought Co website would be of interest and sum it up better than I would. So, I'll just read a little bit of this. It starts off, Halloween is a secular holiday combining vestiges of traditional harvest festival celebrations with customs more peculiar to the occasion, such as costume wearing, trick-or-treating, pranksterism, and decorative imagery based on the changing of the seasons, death, and the supernatural. Halloween takes place on October 31, though it was regarded up until the last few decades of the 20th century as primarily a children's holiday. In more recent years, activities such as costume parties, themed decorations, and even trick-or-treating have grown increasingly popular with adults as well, making Halloween a celebration for all ages. So what does the name Halloween mean? Well, the article goes on to say, the name Halloween is a contraction of All Hallows Even, meaning the day before All Hallows Day, better known today as All Saints' Day, a Catholic holiday commemorating Christian saints and martyrs observed since the Middle Ages on November 1. It goes on to say, how and when did the holiday originate? According to the best available evidence, Halloween originated as a Catholic vigil observed on the eve of All Saints' Day, November 1, in the early Middle Ages. It has become commonplace to trace its roots even further back in time to a pagan festival of ancient Ireland known as Samhain. But, properly pronounced, it suggests Samhain or Samhain, so I guess that's how Halloween got that contraction, about which is little actually known. The prehistoric observance is said to have marked the end of summer and the onset of winter, and was celebrated with feasting, bonfires, sacrificial offerings, and a homage to the dead. Despite thematic similarities, there's scant evidence of any real historical continuity linking Samhain to the medieval observance of Halloween. However, some notable modern historians, notably Ronald Hutton and Steve Roud, who wrote a few books on the subject, flatly reject the popular notion that the Church designated November 1st, All Saints' Day, to Christianise the pagan Celtic holiday. Citing a lack of historical documentation, Roud goes so far as to dismiss the Samhain theory of origin altogether. Certainly the festival of Samhain, meaning summer's end, was by far the most important of the 4 quarter days in the medieval Irish calendar, and there was a sense that this was the time of the year when the physical and supernatural worlds were closest and magical things could happen. Round notes, but however strong the evidence in Ireland in Wales, it was May 1 and New Year which took precedence in Scotland. There is hardly any mention of it until much later, and in Anglo-Saxon England even less. It seems reasonable to conclude that the connection between Halloween and Samhain has at the very least, been overstated in most modern accounts of the holiday's origin. So we'll deviate from that article just slightly for a second, and we'll talk about the religious aspects. Now, there's an article in the Tasmanian paper in the early 20th century that suggests that they claim that Halloween was like the opposite of All Saints Day. So you would have the mumming, the dressing up, to show what the evil can look like and to exercise that maybe a bit. And then the next day you would reflect that by showing all that is good and celebrating what they call is the All Saints Day. So I will read the article for you if I can find it. And yes, so we basically have in this article what they suggest, what a religious person in Tasmania suggests is the real idea of what they were trying to do with that holiday. So this is titled "Let's Look at the Bible." It comes from the Advocate in Burney in 1954. Consider the lilies must have been said in the spring, when the wild flowers of Galilee blossomed. Probably most of the listeners really looked at the flowers for the first time without thinking of them as merely weeds, much less imagining they would give a religious lesson. Do we really look? So do we really pay any attention? I guess that's what they're saying. A few Sundays ago, a coast church had a bowl of spreading yellow blooms and 4 stems bearing scarlet flowers. A lesson of contrast. Yellow is the sacred colour of several eastern countries, and red symbolises the sacrifice in the Christian church. Christ taught that God wanted consecrated lives rather than a display of piety which can denigrate into a sham or actual evil. This coming weekend was used in the Middle Ages to show the contrast between good and evil. On October 31, witches, goblins and all bad spirits were supposed to do their worst, often disguised under attractive magical gifts. On November 1, All Saints, true goodness prevailed, and the 2 days side by side taught the difference. In one, there was fear, in the other, faith and hope. The bowl of flowers the following week contained the same yellow, but pink blooms instead of red. The vivid contrast had gone. The pink blended into the yellow, a reminder that goodwill can bring nations together. But there is a danger in Christians accepting too easily the world's standards of living, until they can hardly be distinguished. Halloween and All Saints should warn us that Christ's followers depend on his power. He expects not seeming holiness, but a full dedication of self. Then we shall find that from the ground there blossoms red life that shall endless be. And that was contributed by Reverend J.M. Hoare of Devonport. So that's a religious outlook on the day of Halloween. It's similar to what we would think, but slightly different. So that's a religious viewpoint on the tradition of Halloween. we'll go back to the Thought Co website. And it lists some of the earliest Halloween customs. The earliest documented customs attributable to Halloween proper grew out of the tandem observance of All Saints' Day, November 1, a day of prayer for saints and martyrs of the church, what we've already gone through really, and also in All Souls' Day, a day of prayer for the souls of all the dead. Among the practices associated with Halloween during the medieval period were the lighting of bonfires, evidently to symbolise the plight of souls lost in purgatory, and souling, which consisted of going door to door, offering prayers for the dead in exchange for soul cakes and other treats. Mumming, a custom originally associated with Christmas, consisting of parading in costume, chanting rhymes, and play acting, was a somewhat later addition to Halloween. Again, however, despite the obvious similarities between old and new, and maybe an exaggeration to say these medieval customs survived to the present day, or even that they evolved into modern Halloween practices, such as trick-or-treating. By the time Irish immigrants brought the holiday to North America in the mid-1800s, mumming and souling were all but forgotten to Ireland itself. Where the known Halloween customs of the times consisted of praying, communal feasting, and playing divination games such as bombing for apples. Well, these traditions were brought over and consisted of the main type of celebration in Tasmania in the early days. So that's So it goes on to say the secular commercialised holiday known in America today would be barely recognisable to Halloween celebrants of even just a century ago, which is very true. Which we go into some Tasmanian newspaper articles, and it suggests that as early as 1849, it's possible that, and probably earlier, that they were celebrating it. And because it mentions Halloween in this little bit, it says Halloween or the Eve of All Hallows, and that's it. And it's basically just a notice, and it says dredging for oysters prohibited until the 1st of April. So obviously for them to mention Halloween, it must have been a thing. Logically, that suggests that to me anyway. And so we follow on to the next, for the most in-depth article, the earliest ones I could find. And so this article, I believe, is from 1878. So the earliest, most in-depth article we can find is 1868, I believe, and it's the Tribune in Hobart, Friday the 1st of November 1878. It goes on to say, those of our readers who indulge in the habit of paying into futurity will remember that last night was the old grand fete of charms and spells and such like. No doubt in Ireland, many parts of Scotland, particularly the West, legendary tales, unco jokes, and mysterious doings are prominent. In the notes to Burns' works, we find the following having reference to that night when fairies light Halloween is thought to be a night when witches, devils, and other mischief-making beings are all abroad on their baneful midnight errands. Particularly those aerial people, the fairies, are said on that night to hold a grand anniversary. So that gives, as early as 1878, they mentioned the Halloween. So it must have been celebrated in Tasmania. Well, you would imagine so. So we go on further, and another article, a really good article in 1895, talks about some of the games that were played. So some of the traditional games played by the young people and probably older people. So this is the Tasmanian Launceston, Saturday the 8th of June 1895. Goes on to say, Your young readers would probably feel interested in the reading of the following games, particulars of which I have taken from various sources. A laughable game for Halloween is to hang a stick by a string so that it can be spun around very fast. An apple is on one end of the stick, while at the other is a lighted candle. The guests try to snatch at the apple with their teeth and generally succeed in seizing the lighted tallow instead. The hands must be tied behind the back, and a bag of sand may be substituted for the candle. A simple nut game is the naming of two nuts, which are roasted on the fire, and as they burn together or start from each other, so will the course of their courting be. There are other examples such as the magic ring, dumb cake, throwing the yard, and one of the most popular is the three saucers. The first is filled with pure water, the second with soapy water, and the third is empty. Someone is blindfolded, led up to the table, and told to dip the left hand. If by chance it is a girl and she touches the first, she is going to marry a bachelor. If the second, her future husband will be a widower. And if the third, she is doomed to die an old maid. So, just stopping there for a sec. Obviously, it was more common to marry a widower back then because it just wasn't the medicine. I don't know, that's pretty obvious, but anyway, we'll continue on. This last must be repeated 3 times, and the dishes changed each time. After the games and a Halloween party come the refreshments, which may be something after the order of nut cake, molasses candy, and as many goodies as one cares to provide. At the close of the evening, the guests are asked to visit the workhouse of the Fates, a dimly lighted room emptied of all furniture. Skeletons and skulls made of paper glare at jack-o'-lanterns in opposite corners, and the 3 sisters draped in white sheets sit beside a low wheel. These are just cutting for a sec. These articles are reasonably faded, so they're a little bit hard to read, so excuse me if I get a little bit jumbled up. One of the sisters is spinning the wheel, one holds the thread, and the third stands ready to cut strands with a pair of huge shears. The guests file in 2 by 2 and are presented with mysterious little square cards, on which may be written such sentiments as indicate the fortunes that fate is preparing for you, and it is well to make the fortunes all good ones. Some of them include: be good, sweet maid, and let who will be clever. Whatever with the past has been, the best is yet to be. Future is merry and in the mood will give you anything. The little cards make pretty and appropriate souvenirs of a jolly evening, a simple and pretty kind of entertainment which boys and girls have tried and enjoyed very much is illustrated fairy stories. The 3 Bears was given successfully not long ago by 3 boys of 7. 3 boys of 7, 10 and 13 years of age. Excuse me, a little bit hard to read. The boys personated the bears that were hungry and fed on soup and who were turned out of their beds and cheated of their dinner by the pretty little maiden, Curly Locks. The bears were clothed in skins of brown Canton flannel made like children's night drawers, with the arms and legs lengthened so as to cover the hands and feet, with the faces covered by masks representing bears' faces. These bears are father, mother and cub, and the baby bear wears a cape. The first scene shows the family just before dinner, the mother knitting, the father reading a newspaper, and the child looking at an immense picture book. When the family sit down to their supper of porridge, they all complain that it's too hot and start out for a walk. Then Curly Locks arrives and she is found by the bears when they return to their walk. There are many other simple fairy stories that children could do nicely without elaborate stage setting. They make very charming little plays. Well, I'm not sure that last one was a Halloween thing, but it's interesting. So the earliest, most in-depth article we can find is 1868, I believe, and it's the Tribune in Hobart, Friday the 1st of November 1878. It goes on to say, Those of our readers who indulge in the habit of paying into futurity will remember that last night was the old grand fete of charms and spells and such like. No doubt in Ireland, many parts of Scotland, particularly the West, legendary tales, unco jokes, and mysterious doings are prominent. In the notes to Burns' works, we find the following having reference to that night when fairies light Halloween is thought to be a night when witches, devils, and other mischief-making beings are all abroad on their baneful midnight errands. Particularly those aerial people, the fairies, are said on that night to hold a grand anniversary. So that gives as early as 1878. They mentioned the Halloween, so it must have been celebrated in Tasmania. Well, you would imagine so. So we go on further, and another article, a really good article in 1895, talks about some of the games that were played. So some of the traditional games played by the young people and probably older people. So this is the Tasmanian Launceston, Saturday the 8th of June 1895. Goes on to say, your young readers would probably feel interested in the reading of the following games, particulars of which I have taken from various sources. A laughable game for Halloween is to hang a stick by a string so that it can be spun around very fast. An apple is on one end of the stick, while at the other is a lighted candle. The guests try to snatch at the apple with their teeth and generally succeed in seizing the lighted tallow instead. The hands must be tied behind the back, and a bag of sand may be substituted for the candle. A simple nut game is the naming of two nuts, which are roasted on the fire, and as they burn together or start from each other, so will the course of their courting be. There are other examples such as the magic ring, dumb cake, throwing the yard, and one of the most popular is the three saucers. The first is filled with pure water, the second with soapy water, and the third is empty. Someone is blindfolded, led up to the table, and told to dip the left hand. If by chance it is a girl and she touches the first, she is going to marry a bachelor. If the second, her future husband will be a widower. And if the third, she is doomed to die an old maid. So, just stopping there for a sec. Obviously, it was more common to marry a widower back then because it just wasn't the medicine. I don't know, that's pretty obvious, but anyway, we'll continue on. This last must be repeated 3 times, and the dishes changed each time. After the games and a Halloween party come the refreshments, which may be something after the order of nut cake, molasses candy, and as many goodies as one cares to provide. At the close of the evening, the guests are asked to visit the workhouse of the Fates, a dimly lighted room emptied of all furniture. Skeletons and skulls made of paper glare at jack-o'-lanterns in opposite corners, and the 3 sisters draped in white sheets sit beside a low wheel. These are just cutting for a sec. These articles are reasonably faded, so they're a little bit hard to read, so excuse me if I get a little bit jumbled up. One of the sisters is spinning the wheel, one holds the thread, and the third stands ready to cut strands with a pair of huge shears. The guests file in 2 by 2 and are presented with mysterious little square cards, on which may be written such sentiments as indicate the fortunes that fate is preparing for you, and it is well to make the fortunes all good ones. Some of them include, be good, sweet maid, and let who will be clever. Whatever with the past has been, the best is yet to be. Future is merry and in the mood will give you anything. The little cards make pretty and appropriate souvenirs of a jolly evening, a simple and pretty kind of entertainment which boys and girls have tried and enjoyed very much is illustrated fairy stories. The 3 Bears was given successfully not long ago by three boys of 7. 10 and 13 years of age. Excuse me, a little bit hard to read. The boys personated the bears that were hungry and fed on soup and who were turned out of their beds and cheated of their dinner by the pretty little maiden, Curly Locks. The bears were clothed in skins of brown Canton flannel made like children's night drawers, with the arms and legs lengthened so as to cover the hands and feet, with the faces covered by masks representing bears' faces. These bears are father, mother and cub, and the baby bear wears a cape. The first scene shows the family just before dinner, the mother knitting, the father reading a newspaper, and the child looking at an immense picture book. When the family sit down to their supper of porridge, they all complain that it's too hot and start out for a walk. Then Curly Locks arrives and she is found by the bears when they return to their walk. There are many other simple fairy stories that children could do nicely without elaborate stage setting. They make very charming little plays. Well, I'm not sure that last one was a Halloween thing, but it's interesting. So this goes into some more customs and traditions, some even more older one. Halloween festival, ancient tradition. This is an old article from Tasmania as well. Or at least, it may not be, some of these may be done by other people and then put into Tasmanian papers. It still points out that, to me, that people still followed Halloween back then. Anyway, Halloween festival, ancient tradition. An old Druidic festival, Halloween or All Hallows Eve, falls on Tuesday, October 31, which is actually this year. Although present observance connotes little belief in the superstition that Halloween in the night of the year when ghosts and witches are most likely to wander abroad, some of the old traditions cling. The name All Hallows Eve is given to October 31 as the vigil of Hallowmass or All Saints' Day. The festival long antedates Christianity, history showing that the original celebrations were purely druidical. It's a hard word to say. Fires of Thanksgiving. On about November 1 each year, the Druids used to hold their great autumn festival and lighted bonfires in honour of the sun god and thanksgiving for the harvest. In later times, the practice of lighting bonfires was retained as an essential part of the observance. In Roman times, other ceremonies were introduced. The custom of lighting bonfires survived in the Highlands of Scotland and in Wales until recent years, and the occasion was one for unrestrained merrymaking. In ancient Ireland, on All Hallows Eve, fires used to be lighted, but gradually candles were substituted for them. The Welsh, however, were more faithful to the tradition, although the significance of illuminations was lost in North Wales. The lighting of the fires was attended by many ceremonies, such as running through the fire and smoke. Each person casting a stone in the fire and all running off at the conclusion to escape a legendary black short-tailed sow, a precursor of evil. Nuts thrown into flames. A feast of parsnips, nuts and apples suspended from a string and eaten without being touched by the hands followed the fire ceremony. Each person threw a nut into the fire, and the way in which it burned disclosed the future. If it burned brightly, it betokened prosperity through the coming year, but if it turned black, alas for the thrower, misfortune would surely follow. On the following day, the stones were searched for in the fire, and if any were missing, evil would be the lot of those who threw them in. Among Celtic people, the old traditions die hard. In Brittany, among seafaring folk, there still survive many out-of-the-way beliefs. One of the most touching and one natural among people who know not what the angry sea has in store for them is still carried out on the eve of All Souls' Day, as they call it. The doors and windows of the homes are left wide open and the table set with food, so that the returning spirits of the dead might feel they are still remembered. In the churchyard where lie so many of the fishermen whose lives were taken by the wrath of the sea, the graves are strewn with flowers and prayers are said for the repose of their souls. There are many of the fishing folk who say that during the hours of the night they hear the whispering of ghostly voices and the sounds of wailing and deep grief. So there's many different traditions, and a lot of them are superstitious, but a lot of them are about caring for those who passed on and respecting the dead, which is something we should do a little bit more of these days, perhaps. I'm not sure. What's your opinion? We move on to another article entitled Witching Hour, Now Amusing Evening, Halloween. In these enlightened days, when romance is supposedly dead and belief in witchcraft, fairies, and the witching hour of midnight has disappeared, the young people transform the rather terrifying, eerie festival of Halloween, commemorated on the evening of October 31, into an amusing party. They pander to the old beliefs only in their decorations, when grinning skulls lit from within by electric torches leer at approaching guests, and pumpkin skins carved with weird faces decorate the mantelpiece. This is a bit of a later article. Anyway. The Festival of All Saints' Day, All Hallows or Hallow Mass, which originated in AD 610, was first instituted on May 1 in the memory of the martyrs, but since AD 834, it has been celebrated on November 1 as general commemorations of all the saints. The most essential part of Halloween ritual seems to be the lighting of each household of a bonfire at nightfall. Of course, on this night, the fairies are supposed to be unusually active. In England and Scotland, Halloween was long consecrated to the harmless fireside revelries, with many ceremonies for divining future sweethearts. The ever-famous Rabbi Burns describes a Halloween party in his poem Halloween, and says, "We merry sangs and friendly cracks, I what they did na weary, and unco tales and funny jokes, their sports were cheap and cheery." According to Irish folklore, those with the seeing eye may look on at the fairy revels, and he who finds himself within the circle of dewdrops dancing on the grass will walk enchanted for life. Legend runs that makers of the black magic ride the Halloween night winds on broomsticks and transform the harmless family cat into a coal-black steed. Legend has it also that on a Halloween night at midnight, a maid who stands in front of her mirror by candlelight, slowly peeling and eating an apple, will see the face of a future husband reflected in glass. Well, we've already gone over that. So that's some couple more little traditions there, and customs and beliefs. Now we get into talking about some things that went on in Tasmania, and those articles suggest that Tasmania was celebrating Halloween way back in the early days, 19th century, 20th century. And this is a little article from 1904. It talks about a couple throwing a big party. They're obviously a well-known couple around town, and they decided to throw a nice little Halloween party in Launceston. So I'll go on to read this. Table talk. On Halloween, October 31, Dr. and Mrs. Stark E. Monterey, Canning Street, entertained a number of friends in a novel and most enjoyable manner. It was customary for our grandfathers and grandmothers to keep up this evening, the name popularly given to the eve or vigil of All Hallows, or Festival of All Saints, by indulging in many harmless revelries and invoking charms to discover who was to be their future partner in life. But of recent years, the custom has quite died out here. The invitations, which were written in quaint old English phraseology, suggested to the guests that the evening would not be spent in the ordinary way, and that the amusements provided would be uncommon, as yellow is the approved colour for a Halloween party. The reception rooms were all prettily decorated with yellow broom, the fireplaces over mantles, etc., being ablaze with it. The first game was trying to get as many peanuts as possible out of a basin of water. Each guest was given a hat pin to stab them with, and allowed 2 minutes to perform the task. Each peanut was counted a point and thus those who secured the largest number of nuts were credited with the most points. The next game caused much merriment. An apple was suspended from the centre of the doorway by a cord, so that it revolved quickly when touched. Each gentleman was given a lady for a partner. They stood on either side of the doorway and made simultaneous movements towards the apple with their mouths, trying to see who could take the largest bites, which indicates good fortune and happiness in this instance too. The time limit was 2 minutes. Well, in this instance too, the time limit was 2 minutes. Each couple secured their own apple and compared it with the others afterwards so that the points could be awarded. Capturing apples from a deep basin of water followed. To do this successfully, it was necessary to go head first in. Only the gentlemen and ladies so fortunate as to possess naturally curling hair were brave enough to do this. Their doing so created great fun. Each one was then taken separately into a dimly lighted room and was given a hand mirror, and told to cry out when a vision appeared therein. One corner of the room was curtained, and as the seeker drew near this, he or she, on turning around, invariably saw the spirit of their future wife or husband reflected in the mirror. Directly they did so, they were shown into another room, given a paper and pencil, and asked to write a description of the vision, what kind of man or woman he appeared to be, if he would make a good husband, etc. This had to be written in a quarter of an hour, and all accounts were then read out, and the the best one voted for. After this, the mystery was explained. Two masks, a man and a woman's, were behind the curtain, which was withdrawn only when each gentleman or lady had her back to it. On going into the supper, each guest in turn cut a slice out of a large cake which stood in a prominent position. Some were evidently have no luck at all. Others drew prizes. The first, a whistle, signified its possessor was the whistle for all she wanted. A thimble denoted its owner would remain a spinster. A pretty little bell indicated that its finder would go through life with bells. A coin denoted untold wealth, and a ring that its owner would speedily marry. Dainty little fancy serviettes were laid, and each in turn handed theirs around the table for the fellow guests' autographs to commemorate the occasion. And so, that's some quaint little party they had in Launceston in 1904. So we move on to this article about how these Halloween socials started up, and it actually started at a society for Scottish people. So this is 1907. At the invitation of a few patriotic Scotchmen, about 80 people assembled in the Temperance Hall, York Street, on Friday evening for the purpose of celebrating Halloween in a Scotcher fashion as circumstances would allow, in accordance with the national characteristics. The proceedings were opened by a musical selection on the bagpipes by Mr. J. G. Campbell. The chair was occupied by Mr. A. Thompson, who, after explaining why they had met together, in a few appropriate remarks, appealed to the guests to use every effort in their power to cherish and foster love and patriotism for their native land, the dear old land of Scotland. With all its associations and tender recollections, it was by such gatherings as the present one that the bond of brotherhood amongst brother Scots was more firmly cemented, and afforded the best opportunity for extending that bond of brotherhood. A varied programme consisting of Scottish songs and recitations, interspersed by dances, was carried out. The following ladies and gentlemen greatly assisting towards it, and it goes on to list several people who helped. And then it goes on to say they had, by special request, Miss Ida Miller and Master A. Parker gave the sword dance, for which they were accorded well-earned applause. At 10 p.m. the company adjourned to an adjoining room where a sumptuous supper was laid, the tables being tastefully decorated and literally groaning under the weight of the good things provided, to which full justice was done. The pride of place was, of course, necessarily given to a real Gurrid, I think that's the word. It's a bit hard to say. Scotch haggis, specially prepared for the occasion by Mr. J. G. Campbell. He's a jack of all cards. Is that the right word? No, that's not right. Anyway, jack of all trades, that's right. And which was ushered into the room with true Highland honours. They did the old traditional honours of the haggis, obviously. After supper, Mr. R. Mowbray said that the circumstance had been such that there was a large number of Scottish people in Launceston who were unattached to any kindred society. It was thought advisable to there and then form a St. Andrew's Society for the purpose of preserving and keeping in remembrance all the best traditions of Scotland, as embodied in Scottish song and story. The achievements of her warriors, the consistency of the nation in times of trial and suffering, and in all that brought lustre to their native land. So basically, this society was formed on Halloween in 1907. Excuse me. And they would go on to do these Halloween socials for the next, probably up until the 50s, basically. And they had a lot of similar things happen, and a lot of these articles are just thanking people, so I won't go through all of them, because it might be a little bit boring, but so that they did that was a very traditional Scottish way of doing things, and that happened for many years until probably the 50s, I think, and maybe after, I'm not really sure. So, as it suggests, there was Halloween being celebrated probably in Tasmania since, the early times, really early times. And so, and up until, in this traditional form, up until, maybe 60s, I guess, early 60s, late 50s. But here's another one from Queenstown. This is the Caledonian Society, and this tells you a couple of little tidbits about some other traditions as well. Queenstown in 1908. The observance of Halloween, which is the Eve of All Saints, is common in Scotland, and with the loyal Caledonian Society in our midst, and always active, it is not to be wondered that the celebration should be extended to Queenstown. Here, however, it took the form of an indoor picnic, and great was the fun therein. It is an occasion on which enjoyment is given to the bands. A band is an old-fashioned term for a child, obviously. And as everyone was admitted free, there were over 200 youngsters present. The forms of amusement provided were very numerous and most hardly entered into. For instance, there was duking for apples, which to onlookers was intensely funny. A number of apples were placed in a bath full of water, and the youngsters have to seize them in their mouths. The reader can imagine what antics are gone through, and what contortions of the face are witnessed. The determination of the contestants is something to marvel at, some of them pursuing the apple even to the bottom of the bath. This next one I'm going to probably massacre because it's a little bit hard to say, but Chumpit Taddies we silla indem is not understood by many, but what is meant is mashed potatoes in which money is distributed. Each child presented a saucer and received some mashed potatoes, and nearly always found a present in it. Among the superstitious classes in Scotland, there is much meaning attached to what one finds in their Chumpit Taddies. If it is a thimble, the finder will be sewing most of their lives. If it is a ring, then theirs will be the good fortune to be soon married. Or again, if it is a piece of silver, they are intended to become rich. Of course, these omens were not allowed to apply on Tuesday night, nor were they hinted at by anyone. Buns, lollies, and other edibles, as well as coffee, was supplied, and there was plenty for all. A circle was formed, and one at a time the juveniles came forward and sang or danced to the delight of all. The chief, excuse me for a thing. So that's the chief of the society. So that's what happened in 1908 in Queenstown, in the west coast of Tasmania. And they wanted to spare the youngsters of that superstition, so they all got a nice present, which is very nice of them. The last social article I'll talk about here is another one of the Caledonian Society, and it has a little couple tidbits of what the Scottish would do in the early 20th century in these socials. And it's in 1921, and it's called, and it's just a little article about the Halloween social. At the invitation of the chieftain of the Caledonian Society, Honourable T. Murdoch, MLC, nearly 200 members and Scotch friends attended a Halloween social which was held at the Masonic Hall on Saturday. Guests including a number of convalescents from the children's home under Sister Lade and several children from the industrial home under the matron, Miss Newman. A telegram was received from the chieftain regretting his absence in Melbourne, sending best wishes for a pleasant evening, and in his absence Major Miller and Captain McCready took charge of the arrangements. Mr. Alex Clark of the Highland Pipers Band played selections on the bagpipes, and several other guests were attired in Highland costumes. Games were indulged in for which prizes were offered. The guests were marched to tea in couples by Mr. Alex Clark to the tune of The Cock in the North, and were attended to by a ladies' committee consisting of, well, several names. I won't read them all out. After tea, the lights were switched off and turnip lanterns were lit. So they did the old turnip lanterns there, which are a bit more creepy looking than the pumpkins. Anyway, after tea, the lights were switched off and turnip lanterns were lit, with which a procession was formed, the effect being weird. Okay. Turnips had been hollowed out until only the thin outer skin remained, and in this, eyes, nose and mouth had been carved out, while some of the more skillful craftsmen had painted on eyebrows and other aids to beauty, and one huge turnip was decorated with flowing ringlets of closely twined shavings, which earned for it the title of Highland Mary. As the younger guests departed, they were each presented with a bag of buns, apples, sweets and nuts. Mr. D. Craig carried out the secretarial arrangements. So that, and then we've got a few articles going all the way through, talking about all these socials and things, and there's even ones in the 80s when kids were doing little articles and showing stories in the papers and things like that. But that's basically a rundown of some of the more traditional ideas of Halloween and the superstitions therein, and the fact that Tasmania and the rest of Australia was celebrating Halloween way before the commercialised American version started. We started celebrating that because when people say, "Oh, it's an American thing," well, it's not actually. Well, there's this version maybe, but current version, but actually this was being celebrated as a part of our heritage very far back, very early into the heritage of Tasmania. So I hope I read that out okay, and I hope it was interesting. And the next thing I'll talk about is some hoaxes, some fun ghost hoaxes, and especially the Hobart Spring Helled Jack. And so that will add to the end of this, and I hope this little Halloween talk has been interesting and informative. So since we're talking about Halloween and, lots of hoaxes happen on Halloween, I'll talk some more about some hoaxes that happened in Tasmania in the early days. And some of these happened in the 19th century and into the 20th century. So I'll read about a couple of these. We get them from newspapers and things like that. There are scattered reports of Tasmanians getting involved in hoaxes, although not as elaborate as ones previously mentioned. They are none the less fascinating and sometimes humorous glimpse of what amused and befuddled people in early Tasmania. 1880, the ghost on the footpath. During 1880, a ghostly excitement gripped Hobart Town as locals had been witness to what they called the ghost on the footpath. This came to head on December 3rd in Salamanca near the old St. David's Cemetery, when a white figure was seen in the middle of the road. Constables gave chase, but were only able to catch the ghost accomplice, a man named Thomas Nevin, who was the town hall keeper. The ghost got away as one of the constables fell as he gave chase. A 5-hour inquiry was held, but Thomas Nevin would not give up the perpetuator's name, and the court could give no reason to prosecute Nevin. So he was let go, but not before he was fired from his job for being drunk in public. That taken from Trove. 1894, A Ghost in Launceston. This is best left the newspaper of the time. Between 8 and 9 o'clock last Monday evening, great commotion was caused in Upper Charles Street, Launceston, by the appearance of a ghost at one of the windows of an empty house opposite the General Hospital. Those who witnessed the vision were considerably alarmed, for the peculiar pallor of the face of a woman who was passing to and fro behind the window pane gave accentuation to the eerie feeling of those who watched. In most cases, one look was sufficient to dispel all the courage they were possessed of. And without a second glance they shivered, turned and fled. Timid ladies were not the only sufferers by the unearthly phantom, seeking a rest for the disturbed spirit. Gallant and strong men turned pale at the sight, and with a quaking sensation at their hearts, they too were only too glad to get away from such an uncanny habitation. At length, some of those whose terrors lent wings to their footsteps hastened to the police with the awful tale. Sub-Inspector Scott and Constable O'Brien entered the house, whilst Detective Sergeant Brannan remained outside. The search at first was fruitless. There was nothing evidently in the house to cause any alarm. The windows were vacant, and so were the rooms. No one in flesh or blood, nor any unquiet spirit, patrolled the stillness of the unbroken solitude. At length diligence was rewarded, and an explanation compatible with ordinary intelligence and common sense was found for the ghost-like visitant. On the floor of one of the rooms, Sub-Inspector Scott found a print of the Princess of Wales' head and bust, probably cut out of an illustrated journal many years ago, and pasted on cardboard. An examination of the window followed, and it was ascertained that some children had apparently got into the house, and having rigged up an apparatus on which to run the picture, they played the prank with the utmost simplicity by having a faint light in the room, and keeping away from the window they drew the lady's representation to and fro before the pane of glass. The effect of the somewhat unique scheme was electrical, and what delight to youngsters must have had at the success of their plans may be left to conjecture. One man who saw the ghost positively declared that he had at last seen one, and no power on earth would make him pass that way on his homeward journey. The mystery having been satisfactorily solved, the house was securely locked up, and no more apparitions are likely to occur. So that's... and now the next one, Scarecrow or Scare Human. The Ghost at Muddy Plains. This tale told in 1924 to the Wild Irishman in the Circular Head Chronicle. An old pioneer relayed this story. We talked about ghosts, and the old chap said he wasn't too sure about them. And he had passed the yellow culvert where the man with the white hat is supposed to promenade hundreds of times, without seeing sight or sign of him. But he said, "There was one incident I'll never forget as long as I live. At the time of the occurrence, we were living at the Thurlstone near Muddy Creek, and it was well known that on dark, stormy nights a white form used to walk the bridge over the creek, making an awful noise. And not many of the people of the district cared to be about after dark. Well, it happened. A lot of us young fellows went to Portsmouth races one Xmas time, and as there was a dance on that night in the hall alongside the old pub, we decided to stay there. On leaving for home at 2 o'clock in the morning, we were well primed with whiskey and under the influence of the spirits within us. Forgot all about the spirit without until we were certain within a couple of chains of the bridge, when to our great consternation we heard a fearful howl and a voice crying pitifully, "Oh me, oh me, oh me, I was buried here 40 years ago." And then there was an awful rattling of chains. Well, we all stood rooted to the ground, and to cap it all, a form dressed in pure white and fully 9 feet high walked out of the scrub on the bridge. There were 15 of us, all told, but when the ghost appeared, 10 found feet and made back to the pub as fast as boot leather could take them. There was one amongst us who never knew what fear meant, my poor brother Dick, who long since he has joined the great majority. Well, Dick said nothing, but calmly walked over to where there was a slip panel and pulled out a rail and went out to meet the ghost on his own. And he did meet him fair in the middle of the bridge, and as Dick struck low the splintering of timber, over went the spirit into the muddy water of the creek, for the said ghost had been mounted on stilts with a long white sheet covering him from head to ground. Well, he let out an awful howl out of him when he hit the stream, louder when Dick pulled him out and added injury to insult by giving him a good punching to knock the water out of him. As he said, well, it turned out the ghost, another friend, had enlisted still not far away, alcohol still, from the bridge, and this was the reason for their masquerading, to keep people away from the place at night. Well, as I said, poor Dick has crossed over now, but when his spirit passed away, one of the best hearts that ever ticked in a human body was silence. That's a couple of little hoaxes. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is Spring Helled Jack, Hobart Spring Helled Jack. And the Hobart Spring Helled Jack, well, the Spring Helled Jack itself originated in London, and it was either some incredible paranormal thing or most likely a massive hoax, a very well done hoax, maybe done by multiple people. Anyway, the blurb on Wikipedia goes, Spring Helled Jack is an entity in English folklore of the Victorian era. The first claimed sighting of Spring Helled Jack was in 1837. Later sightings were reported all over Great Britain and were especially prevalent in the suburban London and the Midlands and Scotland. There are many theories about the nature and identity of the Spring Helled Jack. This urban legend was very popular in its time due to the tales of his bizarre appearance and ability to make extraordinary leaps, to the point that he became the topic of several works of fiction. Spring Helled Jack was described by people who claimed to have seen him as having a terrifying and frightful appearance with diabolical physiognomy. I don't think I said that right, but I will. Clawed hands and eyes that resembled red balls of fire. One report claimed that beneath the black cloak he wore a helmet and a tight-fitting white garment like an oilskin. Many stories also mention a devil-like aspect. Others said he was tall and thin with the appearance of a gentleman. Several reports mentioned that he could breathe out blue and white flames and that he wore sharp metallic claws at his fingertips. At least 2 people claimed that he was able to speak comprehensible English. So that's the basic idea of the Spring Helled Jack in London. So the Hobart occurrence has a somewhat different look, but still similar, and still frightening people. So we'll go on to read the article that I wrote in the book. Some of you probably already read it, but I will. I'll read it out to you for those who haven't heard it before. So, this is an account of a period in 1896 when Hobart was gripped with fear at the appearance of a terrifying phenomenon known as Spring Helled Jack. It is commonly known that this phenomenon was a kind of elaborate hoax perpetuated in many towns and cities all over the world. Some weren't obviously called Spring Helled Jack, but they were a similar idea and a similar hoax. Anyway, there are few accounts of this happening in Australia, and although known as hoaxes, they nonetheless were terrifying to local residents and at times quite dangerous. This account takes place in 1896 and suggests an end to it some years later. There is some information that suggests this happened before, as early as 1880 and as late as 1910 in towns such as Burnie and Beaconsfield as well. As to who it might have been, we are unsure at this point. This article will focus on the rather unusual occurrences of the year 1896. Information gathered from newspaper articles at the time, hosted on the Trove website. And if you're not from Tasmania, Australia, the Trove website can still be a wealth of information because they often had a lot of articles from overseas, and you can get some good. And they loved the paranormal stuff back then, and they wrote a lot about it. I've seen hundreds of articles on international things, so it's a very good source of information, even for non-Tasmanian or Australian things. Anyway, to continue on, in 1896, Tasmanians were being stalked by a terrifying apparition. A large ghost-like figure was appearing in random areas around Hobart. The large figure, dressed in a long black coat worn over a bright white shroud, emblazoned with the words "Prepare to meet your doom" across the chest, would appear and disappear with what seemed to be unusual speed. This individual prowled the streets of Hobart for several months. Women and children were scared to go out, and lovers of encouraged to avoid common love spots and the usual dark alleyways were out of bounds. The first occurrence, as the papers of the time suggest, is around the 20th of May 1896. The first sightings seem to be situated around the old St. George's burial ground and the Sandy Bay tollgate. The paper goes on to say, timid creatures have been nearly frightened out of their wits lately by the appearance of a white-robed figure flitting through the trees at the old disused St. George's burial ground. Now and then the figure has been seen in a field near the Sandy Bay tollgate. They are already sceptical of the spectral validity of the apparition, stating, "No one for a moment suggests that the apparition is a reincarnated being, and if the gentleman who is acting what the Yankees call the ox is sufficiently well educated to be able to read and has sufficient coin to buy a newspaper, he will take a word of advice and drop his tomfoolery." The second incident is recorded in the same article, and seems to suggest that the individual is getting bolder and more brazen. The article continues, "One young lady who was passing Byron Street a few nights since saw his ghost ship and was so terrified she fainted right away, and in this insensible was discovered by a pedestrian who was attracted by her groaning. We never really get to know the true motivation of these acts, but the figure seems to gain the most pleasure out of scaring women." 5 days later, the news heads north. An article appears in the Launceston Examiner and says, "Some senseless person has lately been what is familiarly called acting the ghost in the disused St. George's burial ground. Numbers of females have been frightened at the appearance of the figure in all white, or not in white, all white, in white, and efforts are being made to catch the perpetrator and the so-called joker. And this on the same day in the news and brief section, some fools have been frightening people by acting the ghost at St. George's Cemetery, Hobart. Is the apparition armed? That would seem to be the case, judging by this article in the Daily Telegraph, Launceston. It goes on to say, "Last evening, several lads armed with sticks and stones were watching for him, and they promised to give him a warm welcome should they come in close quarters. Several people have, it is said, been terrified lately by seeing what they term a ghost. The other evening, a lad going past St. Mary's burial ground saw the same object and went after it to see what it was. The ghost scaled the wall and frightened the lad by firing off a firearm. The police are investigating the affair, who it is hoped will have no difficulty in running the dastard to earth." Another article appears the day after, suggesting that several women and children have suffered ill health at the hands of the apparition, and threatens that person doing it will have a lively time of it if caught. It seems as though the figure has ramped up its activities, but also there seems to be more people willing to hang out and try to capture it, or give it a hiding, as the one article suggests on the 3rd. The people were waiting at the Scotch cemetery for an appearance, but were left disappointed as the figure was a no-show. Well, it's probably not, the dude's not going to show up. A bunch of people there, it's not his MO, but they thought they probably prevented it from happening, which is a good thing. Anyway, Northerners threatened. On the 5th of June, a source who may know the perpetrator, or maybe the perpetrator himself suggested to the Tasmanian News that his ghost ship may intend to make his way up to Launceston. The residents appear to be prepared for this, and men from the town form a posse. Newspapers suggest, unfortunately, this article has suffered from age and can no longer be read. So when I wrote that, I'm reading it word for word. So it just basically said they formed a posse and they're waiting for him. But the paper was pretty badly damaged, so it was hard to read any more of what it had to say. But suffice to say, Launcestoners were prepared for the guy. Anyway, the term Spring Helled Jack is mentioned for the first time in the Clipper, an early Tasmanian paper. The ghost is mentioned again as confusion as to what to do grows. 3 other incidents of ghost hoaxers in Tas and the mainland are mentioned. It goes on to say, "It's a pity his career isn't finished like the Adelaide party. They find a ghost there, £4 odd. Not enough for him as money goes there. Put in the insignificant man. Over in Melbourne, it a one-time party carried on his ghostly game so far that a reward of £25 was gazetted for his arrest. They called him Spring Helled Jack on account of the rapidity he displayed in evading the pursuers. It was said he did it for a wager, for when they were looking for him in one place, he turned up somewhere else. The article mentions an incident at Richmond, which happened earlier and doesn't seem to be related. A half-drunken seaman was sailing merrily home one evening in Richmond when the ghost appeared to him. Now the sailor was not a little bit scared, quite the contrary in fact. So he went up to the joker in a good old-fashioned style and knocked him down with an iron bar for his pains. He put up his arms to stop the blow, and the bar broke it and fractured his jaw. Another incident is mentioned that one would believe to be in Melbourne, because the Alfred Hospital is mentioned. It goes on to say that a similar hoax led to the death of the woman. The figure appeared from within an alleyway and caused such a disturbance that she needed to be rushed to hospital, where she died sometimes later. So, if that's the case, it can be quite dangerous, these hoaxes. So just remember that if you're doing the old clown crap or something like that. Anyway, clown crap, what the hell would that look like? Citizens of Hobart protest. A letter to the editor from someone calling himself Anti-Ghost in the Mercury on Friday the 26th of June suggests the police should use firearms to subdue the ghost, and confidence in the police seems to be lowering. The writer mentions another instance where two girls were made ill and they are concerned for the further injury and possible death occurring. Injury to insult. Up to this stage, the ghost caused more emotional injury than physical. But this would change by proxy, as the article in the Clipper on the 27th of June suggests. It goes on to say, it is time that the police should take more energetic measures to discover the people who are working up the ghost scare. During the last few weeks, men, women and children have been scared by the approach of a faked apparition, worked up no doubt by the aid of luminous paint, and even more serious injuries have resulted. Recently, a little child ran into the house and told her mother, a young woman, that the ghost was outside, armed with a fire poker. Armed with a fire poker, the girl ran out and, meeting another little girl in the passage, struck her on her head. To her horror, discovering that in her alarm she had severely injured the infant. In many parts of the city, the usual lovers' walks have been deserted, and servant girls and others are afraid to even get about their ordinary household duties should they take them out into the dark. If the scare is permitted to continue, it is quite possible that some untoward circumstance may eventuate in a tragedy. The most effective way of putting a stop to this devilish masquerade will be for a police reward to be offered. Once let the offenders see that energetic steps are to be taken to discover them, and they will cease from troubling. So, the young lady went out, was frightened by the appearance of a little girl for some reason wandering around in the dark, and whacked her over the head. So you can see why people were getting worried that someone was going to be killed. Plus, they'd heard he had a firearm. The term Spring Helled Jack is mentioned again, and a clearer description of the figure is offered. The senseless individual who is acting the ghost continues to appear at intervals to persons in diverse places, and has so far been successful in eluding capture. But there is an old proverb that the picture goes to the well once too often, and it is on the books that the ghosts will yet make a mistake and find it rather a dear and painful matter to act the fool. A number of highly respectable people have now seen the thing, and their description of it is rather a weird one. It wears a high hat and an overcoat. When it meets somebody whom he considers a fit person to play a lark on, the coat opens and there are exposed the ribs, apparently of a skeleton, the skull and crossbones, and the words, "Prepare to meet your doom." All this is emblazoned with phosphorus, and which, for the time being at any rate, strikes terror into the stoutest heart. He has got rather too close to some, however, who made a dash for him. He was off like a rocket, and with a bound cleared a very high wall, which proved conclusive to his pursuers that he must wear some kind of springs on his heels, like a noted Spring Helled Jack in London some 60 years back. What purpose the ghost has in view, and what satisfaction or pleasure he derives from his pastime, is beyond comprehension. Our informants add that when his ghostship approaches an individual, he throws open his coat by extending his arms heavenward, making them look like two horns, while he also distorts his face and appears a veritable imp of Satan. Very spooky for people at the time. Ghost or goat. Entering into July, a great excitement came over those who worked at the Postal Telegraph Department, for it was believed the ghost had been captured. The article in the Mercury reads, "The ghost. Yesterday evening, considerable excitement was caused in the Postal Telegraph Department by one of the staff rushing in and announcing that the ghost had been captured at Sandy Bay." A few minutes later, one of the messengers appeared on the scene and very excitedly gave the information as authentic. The rumour proved to be unfounded. The other evening, a policeman on duty in Davies Street was somewhat startled by seeing what he took to be the ghost in St. David's burial ground, leaning against a fence. Being some distance away from the unwelcome visitor, he stopped thinking of what he should do. He was alone and actually felt a bit nervous. However, he decided to face the music and, drawing his staff, saunter along, bracing himself up with the thought that he was there to protect life and property. The night was dark, and in the distance he could see the white monster with piercing eyes, staring fixedly at him still. He went on, but wishing all the time that someone else was in his shoes. On getting pretty close to what he took to be the meet me at moonlight alone visitor, he asked him a question, but getting no reply, he made a terrific hit with his staff. The animal, for sure enough, it was a billy goat, dodged and was soon out of reach. It had been standing on a tombstone, and its two forelegs resting on the fence. The policeman suffered a good deal. Mingled with the fence. The policeman suffered a good deal from mingled feelings after this adventure, but was consoled with the proud satisfaction having done his duty. Old man Kerr fights back. An older man named William Kerr was another victim on Warwick Street. He was attending to his horses when the figure appeared before him. Startled at first, but having no belief in ghosts and therefore not being scared in the last, tried reaching for a rock to throw at the apparition. Failing to find a rock, he pulled out his knife and yelled, "Come, man, or come, devil, I am not afraid of you." He then started at the figure with his open knife. The man, sensing danger, turned on his heels and headed towards unoccupied ground to which he could escape, either to Murray or Elizabeth Street. Unfortunately, Mr. Kerr, being of relatively advanced age, was not fleet of foot and was unable to catch the perpetrator. Despite Dr. Crowther's attempts at a solution to the problem, nothing is really achieved, and the ghost goes on the merry way, scaring people. On the 9th of July, he makes another appearance at 9 o'clock that evening, as a woman was making her way home up Colville Street. The ghost leaped from behind bushes and nearly scared the poor woman half to death, her screams being heard by two young men who were in the area. She was still recovering a day later. The ghost appears again in Park Street near Crisp's Timber Yard and Warwick Street. A reward is now offered, and some suggest shooting the individual to rid the town of this menace, if only they could catch him. The Premier now comes under some scrutiny in this article from the Launceston Examiner on the 11th of July. I see that Dr. Crowther, one of the MHA for Kingborough, he has asked the Attorney General if it's his intention to take any special steps to secure the party or parties who, under the guise of ghosts, are causing much fear and anxiety amongst the youthful portion of the people of Hobart and suburbs. Hobart, for years past, has had its periodical attack of ghosts, so it's just about time something was done to lay this uneasy spirit. So that suggests that it had happened before, a few times actually. I will suggest the Premier don that celebrated khaki uniform of his, once so vividly described to the house by its wearer. The coat, if I remember rightly, would fit a medium-sized boy, while the conservations would provide house room for the whole family. Arrayed in his formidable-looking attire, let the Premier, some dark night, station himself in the locality where the spirit takes his customary rounds. When the ghost appears, let him confront it, and at the same time start intoning choice of selections from a certain work on shikar in India. If the apparition gets over the uniform, it will survive the shikar. It will never survive the shikar, that is, unless its capacity for swallowing is much more extensive than I take it to be. The Premier at the time was Edward Braddon. He was Premier in 1896, and he seemed to have a style of his own by the sounds of it. False positive. Seeking some notoriety and to win a wager, a local official is challenged to seek and capture the apparition, and so goes about staking out the area around St. George's Hill. On the third night he was observing and saw a white figure flitting from house to house. Keen to catch the fiend red-handed, he approached, but was quickly disappointed, as the so-called ghost was just a friend of his moving out of a house and into another one nearby. The white bedspread he was carrying covered up almost the entire body, giving him the ghostly appearance. The next encounter, or so information available on Trove, appears on Trove, happens to a rail worker named Mulligan on the 11th of July. These dates are a bit mixed up. Mulligan, a rail worker, was heading home on Park Street. He turned out of the corner on Liverpool Street, and out of nowhere the ghost appears, so close that he was able to grab the figure's coat. Mulligan was much smaller than the ghost and managed to get away up the domain road. Mulligan called for others to help. By that time, it was too late. Caught again? ? By this stage, a rumour was circling of a reward offered to any policeman who captured the ghost. The reward, was said, was £15 for any officer with the ghost under his control. This was not true, and neither were the reports on the 13th of July that the ghost had been captured. The man involved sighted a figure from afar, and thinking he might be the hero that captures the ghost runs towards it. He gets within reach and tussles with it, only to find it a wax head on top of two large sticks with a white sheet around it. Disappointed, he places it on its shoulder and takes it to the police. The following night, a group of youths took upon themselves to form a vigilante posse, and so armed with all manner of weapons one can grab from a garden or home, patrolled the streets between Trinity Hill and the Campbell Street quadrant. Patrol was fruitless, and the only incident that occurred that night was also fruitless. The incident occurred as a couple were walking by the old Wesleyan burial ground when they heard a rustling sound. When they turned to see what the noise was, a figure in white burst out from a hedge that lined an old paddock that faced the cemetery. The figure crossed Adelaide Street and leaped over a 5-foot rubble stone wall. The two set off quickly to tell someone and made it to Arthur, where they recounted to a resident there what had just happened. Still intrigued by all this, they made their way back to the area. They then discovered the remnants of a white towel and footmarks in the mud that were too small to be the ghost, and assumed that it was just another prank, possibly played by a mischievous young lady. A report on the 16th of July suggests through an informant that no one can identify that the individual was doing this as a wager. He is to make £1,000 if he can parlay his act on the streets of Hobart and Launceston and get away with it. There may be some truth in this, as the ghost is reported to have moved north. By the 18th of July, it seems that the ghost may have gotten tired of scaring Hobartians and decided to take his act to Launceston. This account and examiner explains the incident. Prepare to meet thy doom. This is not the subject of an evangelical address or a pulpit homily, as some may at first glance conclude, but rather the startling intimidation which adorned the manly chest of a figure in white, which confronted a peaceable, law-abiding citizen as he wended his way home in Vermeywoods on Thursday evening, in a condition as sober as that of the proverbial judge. Before the astonished pedestrian quite collected his scattered senses, the figure which made its appearance alongside a fence jumped upwards and disappeared over it, vanishing into the blackness of the night. The movement was so sudden and the disappearance so complete that the startled individual came to the conclusion that such a volatile creation could emanate only from a magical lantern and from nothing else. Be this as it may, a ghost of more substantial proportions is reported to have made a sudden appearance on Thursday and last evening for several individuals in such a variety of localities as to either give him the reputation of being ubiquitous or lend colour to the assertion that there is more than one of these undesirable gentry about, whose ardour in their senseless proceedings might well be cooled by a ducking into the nearest pond, or their skylarking propensities ballasted by a charge of box shot in some suitable portion of their anatomy. By now there's a fair amount of hysteria revolving around this subject, with some speculating that he may be someone with serious mental health issues or a former inmate at Point Pure Children's Prison, suffering from the scares of tragedy that one would bear having spent time in a place like that. This hysteria is also leading to some speculative violence, as one man is mistaken for the ghost, gets severely bashed, only to find out he's just a local prone to outbursts and mental health issues. Another gentleman was mistaken, as is written in this article. Now, a friend of mine who carries a thick stick was walking home up Macquarie Street the other evening, and when close to Harrington Street, saw as he fancied a ghostly figure approaching. He was about 8 feet high, and without more ado, he let fly a stick at it. Mr. Johnson's weapon rung off a tin can carried up upon a sanitary gentleman's head, and well, I leave the rest of your comprehensive faculties to figure out. The speculation continues as the spectre is. Excuse me. Well, I'll leave the rest of your comprehensive faculties to figure out. The speculation continues as the spectre is seen in Launceston again. At this time, there is a strong belief that the northern incarnation is a copycat. It is also speculated that if the ghost has indeed moved to Launceston, it is because he has scared all his victims off in the streets of Hobart. Police still seem rather indifferent to the subject, but this may be due to the criticism heaped on them for not catching the figure, and the individual causing them a small amount of embarrassment. This excerpt from an article in the Launceston Examiner indicates the doubt the constabulary have, nor do the police attach any importance to the prevailing epidemic. They have received no reports on the matter, and they stoically maintain from information received that the ghost has no real existence. It will therefore be necessary that the ghost, if there is such one among us, should take an early opportunity of scaring a policeman or two into the middle of the next week, if he would have his personality established beyond all possibility of doubt. The general public, and especially the female portion, by no means share in this indifference. That there is a ghost there seems no reason to doubt, and there are numbers of people who are mistakenly convinced they have seen it. No reason to doubt seems equally certain. It would, however, appear that what has caused the sensation is not a kind of Spring Helled Jack, who can first give people a scare and jump 15 feet in the air over them, but a powerful magic lantern, a sort of miniature searchlight, which is made to play on the fence around the deanery and up and down those in Babington and Middle Streets, which has probably worked from a veranda high up on the hill. This, at any rate, is the opinion of a level-headed man who was startled by the apparition on Saturday evening. The rumours of indifference may be unfounded, though, as referenced in the July 25th by the apparition on a Saturday evening. It goes on to say, these rumours of indifference may be unfounded, though, as referenced in July. Despite all reports, the incumbent police were particularly active during the ghost scare. One gallant bobby hit upon the brilliant, if not original, plan of parading the streets in female attire under the fond delusion that he was disguised, quite oblivious of the fact that the stately tramp of the Hobart bobby is every bit as unmistakably as the brogue of the Sydney cop, and that his distinct disguise was just as easily penetrable as that of the ass-clad lad in the lion skin. However, he put in several evenings in this matter, and not having seen anything unusual in his preambulations, has come to the conclusion that there weren't no bloomin' ghosts at all. The article goes on to tell about another encounter a policeman had. It goes on to say, another policeman got off a little further one night last week, as he certainly made a capture on his beat. He passed High Street, and outside the pub on the corner he spied something suspicious, and at once proceeded to investigate. Carefully approaching the mysterious object, he threw a stone at it, but with eliciting any response, then he got a little nearer and, making a bold rush, managed to secure a double loaf of bread, which some wag had carved in the imitation of a human face, and mounted on sticks, enveloping the whole thing in a sheet. Excuse me. At the end of it all, this might be the end of it all. One more encounter has said to have happened at Evandale, but a look at the article suggests this may have been a sighting of a more traditional nature and not his ghost ship. The sighting seems to have died down by the latter part of 1896, and for some years it appears the person involved in his acts got away with it. Then, in an article on the 27th of July 1909, it strangely says that the police capture the ghost. Seizure of the ghost. Some time ago, it was reported that a male was playing the ghost in West Hobart. The police pooh-poohed the idea and characterised the whole thing as fantasy. It was stated today that a certain person had been caught acting the ghost and was shot in the leg, which required medical attendance. It is further stated that he had attained convalescence, would shortly be prosecuted for his folly. There's probably more to be heard from this story, because that's basically the end. I hope I read that clearly enough. I have a bit of a dodgy throat at the moment, but that's basically as much as we found information on it. It's a very interesting story, and like it got up some funny stuff back then, some quite interesting stuff. So that's the end of the episode, and I hope you enjoyed it. I've not done this a lot, so I'm still getting used to the reading and the speaking. So I hope it was, not too hard to follow. I'm sure it'll hopefully get better as I do more and more of them. But thanks for listening, and that was an incomplete and short history on some Halloween stuff and Halloween in Tasmania, and some ghost hoax stories from Tasmanian history. So thanks for watching, and you can hopefully we'll do another one of these soon, and we'll do the other show soon as well. There'll be new things coming up soon. So thanks for listening again.